Hello everyone, it's me, Dr. Sparkle, with my long-delayed favorite albums of 2014 video. You might think, hey, it's 2016, where's the list for 2015? Well, I am about 1 year behind, but hey, that just gives me more time to sort of think about what I'm going to put on the list. Also, I was going to record sort of like a bonus video at the very end of this. This is going to be my sort of real, correct, sort of genuine favorite prog rock records. Just as kind of like a follow-up to that sort of little practical joke video I uploaded of the 10 best prog rock records of all time. I decided to actually split that off into a separate video, so we'll have 2 videos coming up at once. But let's get started on my list of favorite albums for 2014. A couple albums that didn't make the list because I thought they were perhaps just a little bit disappointing. Fucked Up's album from a couple of years ago, David Comes to Life, was one of my all-time favorite records of the decade. I really had high hopes for this. They'd been on a hiatus for a couple of years. The album is okay, just not great. I don't know. I thought it was a little disappointing. Got a lot of good reviews. The second record actually has a slowed-down version, or at least slowed-down drum version of the album. Kind of an unusual touch, but other than that, I just think there's really not that much special about this record, unfortunately. Another disappointing one was, of course, the new album from Mastodon. They are definitely not at the same level of greatness that they were, back in the 2000s. Last record's really not that great. I would sort of hate to ignore this album. The music's not that great, but the album cover art is absolutely wonderful. They actually used a local artist from here in Sacramento for the artwork, which is quite impressive and very nice looking. I just kind of wish the music was better. I mean, honestly, I think I love the album cover much better than the actual album itself. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get started on my list of favorite albums for 2014. First up, we have St. Vincent's self-titled album. Her last album came out in 2012 or so. She released an album with David Byrne between that one and this one. This one might just be about one of her best records. She's sort of an eccentric singer-songwriter, combines rock, pop, electronic music. Very oddball stuff, very catchy, immensely talented, just a really fantastic record. This thing actually sold pretty well on vinyl, but it was oddly enough hard for me to track down. It took me quite a while before I actually got a copy of this. My local store was always out. Anyway, when I finally got a copy, it sort of lived up to its expectations. If you've seen my list of the last couple years, you know that lately I've become a huge fan of Killer Mike, and this is the second album he made with the producer and rapper LP, Run the Jewels 2. Those of you will recall I had Run the Jewels 1 on my 2013 list, and this one is just as great. Came in this sort of cool, ugly green vinyl here. Since then, as you might know, they released a album version of this with cat samples replacing much of the music called Meow the Jewels. Definitely kind of an oddball musical team. A lot of rap records nowadays don't really appeal to me. I think someone had said that there's a lot of rap music they're making now, just not a whole lot of hip-hop. This is perhaps in the slightly more classic style. It's not done with sort of the obnoxious, goofy production that you hear in a lot of rap albums. There's a lot of great hip-hop stuff out, but a lot of it seems to be in mixtape form. But for sort of actual, regular, plain old album release, I think this is far and away my favorite hip-hop album of the year.
Didn't record cop when he shot, no warning. Heard it go pop, might have been 2 blocks. Heard a kid plus pop, watch cop make girl bleed. Go to home, go to sleep, up again early.
July by Marissa Nadler, a folk singer who's on Sacred Bones Records. This is almost sort of like a dark, eerie, almost haunted sounding record. The production is not really that sparse though. It's actually produced by a guy who also worked with bands like Sun and Earth. Quite a bit of strings on here. It is an interesting and somewhat unexpected record from her. maybe her best one so far, if you're not familiar with Marissa Nadler, and like singer-songwriter folk that's a bit off the beaten path, this one is definitely recommended. TV on the radio. Let me show you the cover on this one here. Don't know how well the effect will show up in the video, but yeah, it has this little piece of plastic that comes over the record cover. This is their first album since 2011's 9 Types of Light, I believe that was called. That was a pretty big disappointment. This one is a pretty big improvement. Maybe not as good as their earlier stuff like Cookie Mountain or Dear Science. Not quite to that level, but it's certainly a very welcome return from TV on the radio. They took some time off because of the death of their bass player, but hopefully they will continue to be making good music.
In the middle of the night, when fear comes calling, saying it'll die.
Okay, moving on to some metal records. Probably the last thing we expected to see in 2014 was a new album from At the Gates. But yet here it is, At War with Reality, their first album in like almost 20 years. They were, of course, a Swedish band who helped invent the so-called melodic death metal sound. A lot of their compatriots, people like In Flames, have gotten pretty sucky over the years. These guys, though, when they finally released their new album, actually turned out to be just great. They sort of picked up right where they left off 20 years ago. Really no complaints about this album at all. It's exactly what you would hope for a new At the Gates album to sound like. Still sounds kind of like the classic band. They sort of moved on a little bit, improved a little bit in some ways, but yeah, really a surprisingly solid album from these guys. Hopefully they'll stick around. Another old metal band that's making a comeback now is Behemoth with their new album, The Satanist. This is sort of done, they started off as a black metal band way back in the 90s, and their current style is sometimes referred to as blackened death metal. Kind of a ridiculous term that makes it sound like it was a Cajun dish or something like that. This is some kind of huge, epic, ambitious concept album type deal. The booklet is actually quite huge and thick and has all these sort of illustrated manuscript type pages in it. This is a surprisingly good record. They might not be making records in the future. The singer, songwriter, etc. is actually quite ill with leukemia, I believe. It's actually kind of amazing this album even got made. Maybe it's going to be their swan song. Very well received album. I'm kind of amazed to see that on Metacritic for the year 2014, it was like the second highest rated album of the year. Anyway, classic band making a bit of a comeback. Just as a note, I was, after I sort of created this list here, I actually went on to Metacritic and looked at sort of like the critics' top pick for 2014, and was surprised to see that of like the top 7 on their list, 6 of them were ones that I had picked out. So unfortunately, there goes my claim to having unusual or eccentric musical taste. I'm afraid I'm now completely mainstream. An album that I absolutely loved was Pallbearers' Foundations of Burden. This is an album that's often categorized as doom metal, but check out the great gatefold cover art here. If this is doom metal, it's definitely of the most sort of inspirational and sort of uplifting and powerful epic variety. It kind of combines, I guess, what you might consider to be doom metal with prog, almost like it's power doom metal. It's definitely not the sludgy dark stuff. It is in places, but really it actually is a surprisingly sort of optimistic type album for what you might call a doom metal album. Anyway, highly recommended. If you do like sort of grim, dark metal, I guess you could do a lot worse than this. This is Lord Mantis, Death Mask is the name of the album, and I apologize for the somewhat not safe for work cover here. This is almost sort of progressive sounding sludge music. Very dark in places, quite technically proficient in other places. Not actually a band I had heard of before, but I heard this album and was totally blown away. So if you don't mind rather ugly, unpleasant music in terms of metal, this one might be something worth checking out. So if you're into any sort of weirdo metal, you've probably heard of this album, the new one from Agalloch, or Agalloch, however they pronounce it. First album in about 5 years or so, Serpent and the Spear. They combine black metal, progressive, folk, sort of everything into one rather strange brew. They're pretty much kind of like the top of the heap when it comes to weirdo metal. Definitely one of the most influential bands of the last 5 years or so. If this is your cup of tea, you probably have already heard of this album. They're actually from Portland, despite the fact they look like they're from some kind of like barren wastelands of Scandinavia. They haven't released a whole lot of albums, only 5 since the late 90s. They obviously take a lot of time with these things, and the results are always stunning. This one is no exception. Okay, moving on to some electronic music. This is one that actually surprised me quite a bit. It is Ciro, the new album from Aphex Twin. However exactly the cover is supposed to go here. Of course, he was a big name back in the mid-90s and so on. His last album in the 2000s, Drugs, was pretty dull and not very interesting. He's released a few things under different names since then. Kind of surprised to hear about a new Aphex Twin record coming out in 2014. I was certainly very skeptical, but it turns out it's actually pretty damn good. Gigantic 3 LP set. Rather surprised that this guy finally came back around after all these years. Okay, here's kind of a tricky one. This is from a soundtrack to a game, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, that came out in 2013. However, it didn't get a physical release until 2014. It was first actually came out in like a super ultra limited edition colored vinyl for Record Store Day, which sold out instantaneously, and then started being sold on eBay for big money. Finally, the record label was nice enough to repress it on regular plain black vinyl. Pretty cool. I know there's like a million sort of retro electronic albums that come out, probably 20 a week that turn up on Bandcamp or something. When I first saw footage from the game and played the game was good, but I really loved the soundtrack. Was hoping they would release it on record. They did. It's great. It's a pretty good pastiche of kind of every sort of electronic synth-driven action movie soundtrack of the 80s. That sort of thing. These guys do it quite well. Here's a record I'm not even really sure how to categorize. Doom, sludge, metal, hardcore, noise, shoegaze. It's kind of everything sort of wrapped up into one rather strange and rather ambitious package. This is Heathen from Thou. These guys are from Little Rock, Arkansas, I believe. They put out a number of records. Somehow this is the one that kind of sort of took all the elements and sort of just completely perfected them. It's a rather strange, noisy, yet oddly beautiful sounding album. It does remind me a bit of Sunbather by Deafheaven. It doesn't really sound like that, but it sort of has that same combination of kind of chaos and noise and beauty together. If that's your kind of thing, this is highly recommended. Kind of a album that took everyone from surprise since they weren't really that well known before this came out, but again, pretty amazing piece of work. And speaking of old guys that came back after a lot of years, we have a new album from Godflesh, World Lit Only by Fire. They were, of course, one of the big industrial rock metal titans of the 1990s. Justin Broderick from Godflesh had been touring with his new band a few years ago, and on tour I actually saw them play a few Godflesh songs, and then suddenly, out of nowhere, we have a new actual Godflesh album. So basically, it's great to have these guys back after all these years. I mean, listen to this record, it kind of sounds like they never left. Alright, so getting into a rather experimental and bizarre album, and I do apologize for the kind of gross artwork on this thing. It's the new album from Pharmacon, Bestial Burden. This is like the limited edition that came in like this weird handmade paper sleeve thing. Here's sort of the regular album cover. This is one of those experimental albums that use like found noises, a lot of like sort of noises of like body sounds, that sort of thing. It was inspired by her own health problems, sudden illness, if she had a tumor of some sort. It is a rather gross album, very much in the theme of sort of like bodily decay, death, that sort of thing. Impressive technically, not exactly enjoyable, but I really do admire this album. If this is your sort of thing, definitely give it a try, but just be aware that the album is not the most pleasant sounding album you will hear this year by any stretch. Okay, so in terms of straight up stoner rock, we have Blood Eagle from Conan. This is just a magnificent chunk of sort of loud, crude, thundering stoner rock with a barbarian theme. Essentially, that pretty much describes this music perfectly. If you look at this, you know, stoner rock, barbarians, the record sounds exactly like you'd think it would, but it's actually quite impressive. Really one of the most enjoyable and silly records I've heard this year. This is kind of an obscure one. Salem's Pot, yet another Swedish band. A lot of these for some reason. What a wonderfully groovy, sleazy cover we have. This is pretty much just sort of silly, bizarre, nasty stoner rock. Very psychedelic, very noisy, pretty wild stuff. Again, not a band I'd actually even heard of until I heard this particular record, but was pretty impressed enough to make it onto my favorite albums 2014 list. If you happen to see a copy of this, you might want to look into it if you are a big fan of this kind of stuff. But yeah, kind of like the surprise hit record of 2014 for me. Moving on to some more international type music, here's one from Thun Narin, Electric Fin Band. These were guys that suddenly became famous out of nowhere when a video of them performing turned up on YouTube. They were like that sort of crazy Thai electric band. They finally got a record made, and boy, this is actually really good. It's sort of this hypnotic, electronic, psychedelic rhythm music. It's kind of hard to describe, but really the fact that these guys got together in the studio and recorded an album this good is actually pretty impressive. It shows that they're not just some random novelty act on YouTube. These guys really do have the goods. If I had heard Goat's 2013 live album, I would have put it on that list. I didn't. It's a great record, but I'm going to put 2014's Commune on my list here. Again, a band from Sweden for some reason, again with a kind of cool die-cut cover. This is, in theory, some kind of world music, sort of hypnotic, swirling, trance-like rhythmic music with sort of these complicated overlocking rhythms. Kind of reminds you maybe a little bit of like juju music from Nigeria. kind of a strange style of music, but it is very wonderful. And again, this is just one of the most fun records I've heard this year. If you like that weird kind of stuff, by all means, I would find a copy of this. So speaking of albums that I never thought would exist, it is Soused by Scott Walker and Son, of all people. Scott Walker, if you don't know him, was a singer in the 60s, singer-songwriter, big influence on David Bowie. He released albums sporadically in the 70s, 80s, and so on. Not a whole lot of albums, like once every decade it seems. He's kind of like Bowie squared. This is a rather unusual album that's not for everyone. It sounds like what I would have wanted Bowie's The Next Day to be. Challenging music. A lot of people will hear this stuff and want to turn it off instantly, but if you like this kind of oddball stuff, give it a try. Scott Walker is a notoriously difficult personality in real life. Brian Eno tried to make an album with him and he couldn't put up with Scott's stuff. Still definitely a pretty cool and bizarre record.
A beating would do me a world of good.
Okay, getting down to the last two big ones here. Here's an album that probably everyone has heard. This came out at the very, very, very end of 2014. This is D'Angelo's Black Messiah. His first album in 15 years. He apparently spent years working on this, and then suddenly announced the album was actually coming out. Everyone was pretty amazed and surprised. Sort of a dark, political, angry album. People compare it almost inevitably to Sly and the Family Stone's There's a Riot Going On. 15 years is a long time to come out between albums. Is it worth the wait? Yeah, maybe. I mean, it is a really, really, really solid album of sort of his, kind of like sophisticated soul or deep soul. I don't know how you exactly categorize this, but man, this is one great album. It was recorded apparently entirely in analog, so people were quite excited about the LP version, which supposedly sounds a lot different than the CD version. Anyway, I'm sort of putting this at the almost the very top of my list for 2014. And in just a second, we will see the #1 spot. Okay, lastly, and maybe greatestly, I don't know, it's the new one from the Swans, To Be Kind. They have this wonderful sort of upset baby faces in the artwork as well as the gatefold as well. In terms of epic grandiosity, there's really not much this year to match it. It's a massive 3 LP set, huge long songs that sort of build and power and keep climaxing. This is the third album they put out since they've reformed. Everyone has been perhaps a little bit more magnificent than the last. They of course were a band from the 80s, 90s, broke up, suddenly reunited a few years ago, and different style of music, very different sound, but even though it's different, it's just as great as they ever were. One of the absolute best Swans albums right here. I guess if you ordered it directly from the band, you actually got it signed. Anyway, don't know that I have a favorite album of 2014, but this one is pretty darn close.
Slow the oxygen!
Hey folks, one last thing before we go. There of course are millions and millions of great reissues that come out every year, but there were a couple that really sort of stood out among the rest, so I'd like to sort of put in a few of the best or my favorite reissues for the year 2014. Now the big one, I suppose, for a lot of people was probably this enormous monster right here, the Beatles in Mono box. The Beatles have had actually kind of a shaky history when it comes to their releases. In the US, the original albums were, resequenced, weird stereo effects put on. Later, of course, they all reverted to the UK albums as the official Beatles catalog. The first CD versions weren't really that great sounding, no one particularly cared for them. Finally, around 2009, they digitally remastered them and released both stereo and mono versions on CD and vinyl. But this thing right here was, I think, the thing that a lot of people were sort of waiting for, the kind of like Platonic ideal of how the Beatles should be presented. This massive 400-pound box here, which contains the mono masters of all the Beatles records that were actually mixed in mono. So that would be from their first album, Please Please Me, to the White Album, and then the Beatles singles. These are actually really, really nice reproductions. I mean, these are exact, perfect reproductions of the original LP mono albums. Right down to the packaging, the sleeves, everything. There's a lot of quality in terms of these things. I mean, the actual covers, the artwork reproduction is just really fantastic looking. The reproductions are top notch. I mean, they even have stuff like the inserts and the fake mustache and stuff. It came with Sgt. Pepper's. Pretty much an ideal presentation of the Beatles music. If you're not into this sort of thing, you might not know that in most cases the mono mixes of the Beatles albums are considered to be a bit better than the stereo. And the thing was that unlike the CDs and the original LPs, which were digitally remastered, these were actually cut directly from the original analog tapes. In Abbey Road Studios, they simply put the analog tapes on, cut them directly to vinyl. They even got the locking groove at the end of Sgt. Pepper's on there, okay. So sort of kind of like this, the one sort of version of the Beatles albums that a lot of people have been waiting for years and years, finally came to pass. The only thing that's not so hot is they do come these sort of thin mylar sleeves. They tends to rip, especially around the corners. I can imagine these sleeves not lasting for years and years, but I suppose a minor complaint in one regard, but everything else, and this is sort of like the perfect collection of those Beatles albums. Everything except for the last two albums, of course, but really it's a pretty massive and amazing box set, and sounds spectacular. Probably the best way to listen to the Beatles music. So another really, really huge release for me, reissue, was this one right here. The complete recording sessions, I believe, of the Lucifer Rising soundtrack by Bobby Beausoleil. Lucifer Rising was the Kenneth Anger film. Bobby Beausoleil did the original soundtrack. Well, actually, originally Jimmy Page did the soundtrack. That didn't work out, and Bobby Beausoleil did the music that ended up in the final movie. You might know that he was actually convicted of murder, and I believe is still in prison. These are like these colored vinyl variations here, each in a different color, supposedly chosen by Beausoleil himself to sort of represent various kinds of mystic ideals. The Lucifer Rising soundtrack has been available in CD form, and even a few vinyl forms over the years. This is, I guess, apparently sort of like the complete recordings. Comes with a large fold-out poster here. It's really a very nice set. The earlier versions of this, or whatever variations of combinations of the actual soundtrack plus the various outtakes and sessions and whatnot, are mostly out of print, I believe. The vinyl versions came and went pretty quickly. This is, I think, far and away the most complete version of the Lucifer Rising music that has ever been released. So, again, something that I personally been waiting for a long time. Finally came out in a really, really nice package, really nice format. Sounds great. For me, again, one of the huge reissues of the year. And lastly, but definitely not least, speaking of mystic types of filmmakers, we have Mississippi Records released this thing right here. It is the complete 4 volumes of Harry Smith's Anthology of American Folk Music. if you know anything about folk music at all, you might know that this was a compilation that was released by Smithsonian Records in 1952, curated by Harry Smith, the filmmaker, mystic, all-around odd fellow. Huge influence on people like Bob Dylan. He was one of the first guys to sort of trawl through old 78s and compile an anthology of old folk music and blues, ballads, all kinds of strange things, work songs, murder ballads, all that kind of stuff. The original versions that came out in '52 are, I mean, not just out of print. I mean, you will never see a copy of these. They were actually extremely expensive when they first came out. And, I mean, nowadays, I'm sure copies don't turn up on the market very often. And I have no idea how much they cost, but you'll probably never get your hands on one yourself. And these are complete reproductions of what they originally looked like, including the original book, which has very eccentric and charming annotations from Smith himself about each of the songs. Each set is 2 LPs. There's the original anthology volumes 1 through 3 that were released in 1952, and it also includes the 4th volume, which was compiled or sort of planned by Harry Smith back then. He was never actually released until the 90s, when I think John Fahey released it on his record label. They included this one here as well, so now we kind of, for the first time, actually have the complete set of all 8 LPs of the Anthology of American Folk Music on record. I think this sold out relatively quickly. It's from a little company in Oregon called Mississippi Records. I'm sure you can still find copies on eBay or whatever. I snatched these up pretty quick. I think each volume was $35, so it wasn't exactly cheap, but certainly a pretty good deal for something of this caliber, especially when the original albums would cost you untold sums of money to actually purchase. And the music itself is pretty much beyond reproach. Many sort of at that time unknown songs that have since become classics. So that's something that was not available on vinyl for quite some time. This is a pretty amazing collection. And really they are nicely made too, though the sort of cloth covers, it's easy to get them dirty and dusty. So that pretty much wraps up my favorite records of 2014 list. As I mentioned, there is a bonus video that was originally attached on the end of this, but this one was getting too long. So I'll put a link down below where you can click on to see my actual real-life, true-life favorite progressive rock albums. Thanks so much. Bye.